The economy of Honduras is based mostly on agriculture, which accounts for 14% of its gross domestic product in 2013. Leading export coffee accounted for 22% of total Honduran export revenues. Bananas, formerly the country's second largest export until being virtually wiped out by 1998's Hurricane Mitch, recovered in 2000 to 57% of pre-Mitch levels. Cultivated shrimp is another important export sector. Since the late 1970s, towns in the north began industrial production through maquiladoras, especially in San Pedro Sula and Puerto Cortes. Honduras has extensive forests, marine, and mineral resources. Although widespread slash-and-burn agricultural methods continue to destroy Honduran forests, unemployment is estimated at around 28%. The Honduran economy grew 4.8% in 2000, recovering from the Mitch-induced recession of 1999. The Honduran maquiladora sector, the third largest in the world, continued its strong performance in 2000, providing employment to over 120,000 and generating more than $528 million in foreign exchange for the country. Inflation, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, was 10.1% in 2000, down slightly from the 10.9% recorded in 1999. The country's international reserve position continued to be strong in 2000, at slightly over $1 billion. Remittances from Hondurans living abroad rose 28% to $410 million in 2000. The lempira was devaluing for many years but stabilized at L19 to the US dollar in 2005. The Honduran people are among the poorest in Latin America. Gross national income per capita is $1,649. The average for Central America is US $6,736. Honduras is the fourth poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Only Haiti, Nicaragua, and Guyana are poorer. Utilizing alternative statistical measurements in addition to the gross domestic product can provide greater context for the nation's poverty. The country signed an enhanced structural adjustment facility, later converted to a poverty reduction and growth facility with the International Monetary Fund in March 1999. Honduras continues to maintain stable macroeconomic policies. It not been swift to implementing structural changes such as privatization of the publicly owned telephone and energy distribution companies, changes which are desired by the IMF and other international lenders. Honduras received significant debt relief in the aftermath of Hurricane Mitch, including the suspension bilateral debt service payments and bilateral debt reduction by the Paris Club, including the U.S., worth over $400 million. In July 2000, Honduras reached its decision point under the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, qualifying the country for interim multilateral debt relief. Lack of resources, lack of arable land, and a small domestic market continue to impede economic progress in Honduras. Most significantly, Honduras lacks abundant natural resources. Only land appears to be plentiful and readily exploitable. But the presence of apparently extensive land is misleading because the nation's rugged, mountainous terrain restricts large-scale agricultural production to narrow strips on the coasts and to a few fertile valleys. Honduras's manufacturing sector has not yet developed beyond simple textile and agricultural processing industries and assembly operations. The small domestic market and competition from more industrially advanced countries in the region have inhibited more complex industrialization. Economic history. After Honduras achieved independence from Spain in the early 19th century, its economic growth became closely related to its ability to develop attractive export products. During much of the 19th century, the Honduran economy languished. Traditional cattle raising and subsistence agriculture produced no suitable major export. In the latter part of the century, economic activity quickened with the development of large-scale, precious metal mining. The most important mines were located in the mountains near the capital of Tegucigalpa and were owned by the New York and Honduras Rosario Mining Company. Silver was the principal metal extracted, accounting for about 55% of exports in the 1880s. Mining income stimulated commercial and ancillary enterprises, built infrastructure, and reduced monetary restraints on trade. There were few other beneficial economic effects, however, because the mining industry was never well integrated into the rest of the Honduran economy. The foreign mining companies employed a small workforce, provided little or no government revenue, and relied mostly on imported mining equipment. 20th century Honduras's international economic activity surged in the early 20th century. Between 1913 and 1929, its agricultural exports rose from $3 million to $25 million. These golden exports were supported by more than $40 million of specialized banana company investment in the Honduran infrastructure and were safeguarded by United States pressure on the national government when the companies felt threatened. The overall performance of the Honduran economy remained closely tied to banana prices and production from the 1920s until after the mid-century. Because other forms of commercial export agriculture were slow to emerge. In addition, until drastically reduced in the mid-1950s, the workforce associated with banana cultivation represented a significant proportion of the wage earners in the country. Just before the banana industry's largest strike in 1954, approximately 35,000 workers held jobs on the banana plantations of the United Fruit Company or the Standard Fruit Company. After 1950, Honduran governments encouraged agricultural modernization and export diversification by spending heavily on transportation and communications infrastructure, agricultural credit, and technical assistance. During the 1950s, as a result of these improvements and the strong international export prices, beef, cotton, and coffee became significant export products for the first time. Honduran sugar, timber, and tobacco also were exported, and by 1960 bananas had declined to a more modest share of total exports. During the 1960s, industrial growth was stimulated by the establishment of the Central American Common Market. As a result of the reduction of regional trade barriers and the construction of a high common external tariff, some Honduran manufactured products, such as soaps, sold successfully in other Central American countries. Because of the greater size and relative efficiency of the Salvadoran and Guatemalan industrial sectors, however, Honduras bought far more manufactured products from its neighbors than it sold to them. After the 1969 soccer war with El Salvador, Honduras effectively withdrew from the CACM. Favorable bilateral trade arrangements between Honduras and the other former CACM partners were subsequently negotiated. However, a political shift in the 1980s had strong and unexpected repercussions on the country's economic condition. Beginning in late 1979, as insurgency spread in neighboring countries, Honduran military leaders enthusiastically came to support United States policies in the region. This alignment resulted in financial support that benefited the civilian as well as the military ministries and agencies of Honduras. Honduran defense spending rose throughout the 1980s until it consumed 20 to 30% of the national budget. Before the military build-up began in fiscal year 1980, United States military assistance to Honduras was less than $4 million. Military aid more than doubled to reach just under $9 million by FY 1981, surged to more than $31 million by FY 1982, and stood at $48.3 million in FY 1983. Tiny Honduras soon became the 10th largest recipient of United States assistance aid. Total economic and military aid rose to more than $200 million in 1985 and remained at more than $100 million for the rest of the 1980s. The increasing dependence of the Honduran economy on foreign aid was aggravated by a severe, region-wide economic decline during the 1980s. Private investment plummeted in 1980, and capital flight for that year was $500 million. To make matters worse, coffee prices plunged on the international market in the mid-1980s and remained low throughout the decade. In 1993, average annual per capita income remained depressingly low at about $580, and 75% of the population was poor by internationally defined standards. Traditionally, Honduran economic hopes have been pinned on land and agricultural commodities. Despite those hopes, however, usable land has always been severely limited. Honduras's mostly mountainous terrain confines agriculturally exploitable land to narrow bands along the coast and to some previously fertile but now largely depleted valleys. The country's once abundant forest resources have also been dramatically reduced, and Honduras has not derived economically significant income from mineral resources since the 19th century. Similarly, Honduras's industrial sector never was fully developed. The heady days of the CACM, which produced an industrial boom for El Salvador and Guatemala, barely touched the Honduran economy except to increase its imports because of the comparative advantages enjoyed by the Salvadoran and Guatemalan economies and Honduras's inability to compete. Bananas and coffee have also proven unreliable sources of income. Although bananas are less subject to the vagaries of international markets than coffee, natural disasters such as Hurricane Fifi in 1974, drought, and disease have appeared with a regular, albeit random, frequency to take their economic toll through severely diminished harvests. Moreover, bananas are grown and marketed mostly by international corporations, which keep the bulk of wealth generated. Coffee exports, equally unreliable as a major source of economic support, surpassed bananas in the mid-1970s as Honduras's leading export income earner. But international price declines coupled with huge fiscal deficits underlined the vulnerability of coffee as an economic base. 1990s. As Honduras entered the 1990s, it did have some factors working in its favor: relative peace and a stronger civilian government with less military interference in the politics and economy of the country than in past years. The country was hobbled, however, by horrendous foreign debt, could claim only diminished natural resources, and had one of the fastest growing and urbanizing populations in the world. The government's daunting task then became how to create an economic base able to compensate for the withdrawal of much United States assistance, without becoming solely dependent on traditional agricultural exports. In the 1990s, bananas were booming again, particularly as new European trade agreements increased market size. Small banana-producing cooperatives lined up in the 1990s to sell their land to the commercial giants, and the last banana-producing lands held by the government were privatized. Like most of Central America, Honduras in the 1990s began to woo foreign investors, mostly Asian clothing assembly firms, and it held high hopes for revenue to be generated by privatizing national industries. With one of the most strike-prone labor forces in Central America, debt burden and aging industrial assets, and a dramatically underdeveloped infrastructure, Honduras, however, has distinct economic disadvantages relative to its Central American and Caribbean neighbors, who compete with Honduras in the same export markets. Honduran President Rafael Leonardo Colegius Romero, elected in November 1989, enjoyed little success in the early part of his administration as he attempted to adhere to a standard economic austerity package prescribed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. As the November 1993 presidential elections drew closer, the political fallout of austere economic measures made their implementation even less likely. Any hope for his party's winning the 1993 election was predicated on improving social programs, addressing employment needs, and appeasing a disgruntled, vocal public sector. However, reaching those goals required policies that moved away from balancing the budget, lowering inflation, and reducing the deficit and external debt to attract investment and stimulate economic growth. Jaetguz inherited an economic mess. The economy had deteriorated rapidly, starting in 1989, as the United States Agency for International Development pointedly interrupted disbursements of its grants to Honduras to signal displeasure with the economic policies of the old government and to push their new government to make economic reforms. Non-dispersal of those funds greatly exacerbated the country's economic problems. Funds from the multilateral lending institutions, which eventually would help fill the gap left by the reduction of United States aid, were still under negotiation in 1989 and would be conditioned first on payment of arrears on the country's enormous external debt. Between 1983 and 1985, the government of Honduras, pumped up by massive infusions of external borrowing, had introduced expensive, high-tech infrastructure projects. The construction of roads and dams, financed mostly by multilateral loans and grants, was intended to generate employment to compensate for the impact of the region-wide recession. In reality, the development projects served to swell the ranks of public sector employment and line the pockets of a small elite. The projects never sparked private sector investment or created substantial private employment. Instead, per capita income continued to fall as Honduras's external debt doubled. Even greater injections of foreign assistance between 1985 and 1988 kept the economy afloat. But it soon became clear that the successive governments had been borrowing time as well as money. Foreign aid between 1985 and 1989 represented about 4.6% of the gross domestic product. About 44% of the government's fiscal shortfall was financed through cash from foreign sources. Side effects of the cash infusion were that the national currency, the lempira, became overvalued and the amount of exports dropped. A booming public sector, with its enhanced ability to import, was enough to keep the economy showing growth, based on private consumption and government spending. But the government did little to address the historical, underlying structural problems of the economy, its overdependence on too few traditional commodities and lack of investment. Unemployment mushroomed, and private investment withered. By 1989, President Jaetguz's broad economic goal became to return Honduran economic growth to 1960–80 levels. During the decades of the 1960s and 1970s, the country's economy, spurred mostly by erratically fluctuating traditional agricultural commodities, nevertheless averaged real annual growth of between 4 and 5%. At the end of the 1980s, however, Jaetguz had few remaining vehicles with which to pull the country out of the deep region-wide recession of the 1980s. Real growth between 1989 and 1993 translated to mostly negative or small positive per capita changes in the GDP for a population that was growing at close to 4% annually. President Jaetguz attempted to adhere to conditions of desperately needed new loans, cutting the size of the public sector workforce, lowering the deficit, and enhancing revenues from taxes, as mandated by the multilateral lending institutions, were consistently his biggest stumbling blocks. Despite his all-out effort to reduce the public sector deficit, the overall ratio of fiscal deficit to the GDP in 1990 showed little change from that in 1989. The total public sector deficit actually grew to 8.6% of the GDP, or nearly $1 billion, in 1991. The 1993 deficit expanded to 10.6% of the GDP. The Honduran government's medium-term economic objectives, as dictated by the IMF, were to have generated real GDP growth of 3.5% by 1992 and 4% by 1993. In fact, GDP growth was 3.3% in 1991, 5.6% in 1992, and an estimated 3.7% in 1993. The economy had operated so long on an ad hoc basis that it lacked the tools to implement coherent economic objectives. Solving the most immediate crisis frequently took precedence over long-term goals. Inflation. By 1991, President Jaetguz had achieved modest success in controlling inflation. Overall inflation for 1990 had reached 36.4%, not the hyperinflation experienced by some Latin American countries, but still the highest annual rate for Honduras in 40 years. The Honduran government and the IMF had set an inflation target of 12% for 1992 and 8% for 1993. The actual figures were 8.8% in 1992 and an estimated 10.7% for 1993. Hondurans had been accustomed to low inflation, partly because pegging the lempira to the dollar linked Honduras's inflation rate to inflation rates in developed countries. But the expectation for low inflation made the reality of high inflation that much worse and created additional pressures on the government for action when inflation soared in 1990.